What if I told you that your government once poisoned 10,000 of its own citizens on purpose? That they sprayed entire cities with bacteria just to see what would happen? That they dosed random Americans with LSD in a brothel while agents watched through mirrors? You probably think I'm describing a dystopian novel. Maybe a conspiracy theory your uncle forwards at 2 o'clock in the morning. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Every single thing you're about to hear is documented, declassified, and verifiable. These aren't theories. They're facts that were hidden in classified files until whistleblowers, lawsuits, or congressional investigations dragged them into the light. So, before we begin, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like because YouTube's algorithm doesn't love dark history. And I need your help making sure these stories actually reach people. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and prepare to learn 100 things your government did that they really hoped you'd never find out about. Let's start in 1932, in a place called Macon County, Alabama. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. It's 1932. The Great Depression is crushing America, and in Macon County, Alabama, the U.S. Public Health Service approaches nearly 400 black men. They tell them they're receiving free healthcare for bad blood. Generous, right? Except here's the thing. These men had syphilis, and the government knew it. For 40 years, doctors watched these men suffer. They documented the progression of untreated syphilis as it destroyed their bodies, their minds, their lives. Even after penicillin became the standard cure in 1947, they withheld it. They didn't tell the men what they actually had. They just observed, like you'd watch mold grow on bread in a science fair project. Except the bread was human beings with families. 28 men died directly from syphilis. 100 more died from complications. Their wives contracted it. Their children were born with it. The study didn't end until 1972, when a whistleblower leaked it to the press. But of course, medical ethics violations were just getting warmed up. And speaking of experiments, people didn't consent to. Let's talk about the Central Intelligence Agency and their relationship with lysergic acid diethylamide, or, as your cool uncle calls it, LSD. From 1953 to 1973, the CIA ran a program called MKUltra. The goal, mind control. The method, drugging thousands of Americans without their knowledge or consent. We're talking prisoners, mental patients, random citizens at bars. The CIA literally funded a brothel operation in San Francisco, where they dosed Johns with LSD through one-way mirrors, for science. They gave it to soldiers, to hospital patients, to university students who thought they were participating in normal studies. One CIA officer even spiked his colleague's coffee with LSD. That guy later died by jumping through a window. Oops. The craziest part. We only know about this because someone forgot to shred the files. Most of the records were destroyed on purpose in 1973, so if you've ever felt paranoid, just remember, sometimes the paranoia is justified. Speaking of justified paranoia, military leaders have actually pitched staging terrorist attacks. Operation Northwoods. It's 1962. Cuba is right there, just 90 miles from Florida, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff are getting creative. By creative, I mean they unanimously approved a plan to stage false flag terrorist attacks on American soil to justify invading Cuba. The proposal included hijacking planes, bombing U.S. cities, sinking boats full of Cuban refugees, and blaming it all on Castro. They wanted to create a helpful wave of national indignation. Their words, not mine. They even suggested painting a plane to look like a civilian aircraft, filling it with fake passengers, and shooting it down. Just normal Pentagon stuff. President Kennedy read the proposal. Then he said no, firmly. The kind of no that ends careers. The operation never happened, but the document sat in a vault until it was declassified in 1997. You can read it yourself. It's real. Now, if you think that's the only time the government got creative with surveillance and disruption tactics, buckle up, because the FBI had a whole program for that. COINTELPRO. From 1956 to 1971, the FBI ran a delightful program called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. Their mission, surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting American citizens who had opinions the government didn't like. Civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, the Black Panthers. Even Albert Einstein had a file. But the FBI's special project was Martin Luther King Jr. They wiretapped his home, his hotel rooms, his phones. They recorded his private conversations, looking for anything to destroy his reputation. Then they sent him a letter, an anonymous letter suggesting he kill himself before accepting the Nobel Peace Prize. They included audio recordings from their surveillance, implying they'd release them if he didn't comply. This wasn't a rogue agent. This was official policy. J. Edgar Hoover personally approved operations to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize activists. They didn't just watch people. They actively tried to destroy their lives, relationships, and organizations. But surveillance wasn't the only creative solution. The government found two problems. Sometimes they just added poison to things people were already drinking. Poisoned alcohol during Prohibition. Let's rewind to the 1920s. Prohibition is in full swing. And Americans are still drinking. Because of course, they are. The government's frustrated. So they decide to try a new tactic. Poisoning the alcohol supply. Industrial alcohol was regularly stolen and redistilled into bootleg liquor. The government knew this. So they ordered manufacturers to add even more toxic chemicals, things like methanol, gasoline, benzene, and acetone. The idea was to make people too sick to drink. The reality, they made people dead. By the end of Prohibition in 1933, an estimated 10,000 Americans had died from government-poisoned alcohol. On Christmas Eve, 1926 alone, 60 people died in New York City from toxic booze. The government kept doing it anyway. Medical examiners called it murder. The government called it deterrence. Either way, people kept drinking and kept dying. Because apparently, the best way to handle a public health issue is to add more poison. And speaking of adding things to people without asking, let's talk about what they did to pregnant women. Radiation experiments on pregnant women. It's the 1940s and 50s, and scientists are very curious about radiation. So curious, in fact, that they decide to feed radioactive iron to hundreds of pregnant women at Vanderbilt University and other institutions. The women were told they were receiving vitamin supplements to help their babies. They were not informed that these vitamins were radioactive isotopes. The goal was to study how radiation moves through the body and into the fetus suit. No, for science. And by science, I mean, we want to know what happens during nuclear fallout. So let's use pregnant women as test subjects. The study tracked these women and their children for years. Some of the children developed cancer. The government didn't tell the families about the radiation until decades later. When the story finally broke in the 1990s, settlements were paid, apologies were issued. The usual, but hey, at least those experiments were conducted in hospitals. Sometimes the government preferred to do their testing out in the open air, where everyone could participate without knowing. Operation Sea Spray, September 1950. The U.S. Navy has a question. What would happen if someone released biological weapons over an American city? And instead of, running a simulation, they decide to just do it for real over San Francisco. For 6 days, Navy ships sprayed clouds of bacteria Serratia marcescens and Bacillus glebigiosa, the city. The military considered these bacteria harmless. The wind carried them over 2 miles inland. The bacteria settled on buildings, on streets, in people's lungs. Shortly after, hospital admissions for pneumonia and urinary tract infections spiked. One man, Edward Nevin, died from a Serratia infection. His grandson later sued the government. The government's defense: we didn't think it would hurt anyone. They lost anyway. This wasn't the only biological test. Between 1949 and 1969, the military conducted hundreds of secret biological warfare tests on American cities. But at least they were testing on living people. Sometimes they preferred to use the dead, specifically babies. Project Sunshine. Let me tell you about Project Sunshine, which is quite possibly the most unfortunately named government program in history. In the 1950s, scientists wanted to measure strontium-90 levels from nuclear fallout. Strontium-90 accumulates in bones, especially young bones. So, they needed samples, lots of samples. Their solution: they secretly collected body parts from dead babies and children around the world, over 1,500 samples. They didn't ask parents for permission. They just took pieces during autopsy. Legs, ribs, entire spines. Then they shipped them back to the United States for testing. Parents had no idea their children's bodies had been harvested. Some remains were taken from countries like Australia, South America, and Europe. When the program was exposed in the 1990s, governments issued apologies. The families, they got to live with the knowledge that their babies' corpses had been mined for Cold War data. But body snatching wasn't the government's only creative strategy. Sometimes wealthy Americans tried to skip the middleman entirely and just overthrow democracy themselves. The business plot. 1933. The Great Depression is destroying America, and President Franklin Roosevelt is passing New Deal policies left and right. This makes wealthy industrialists very nervous. So nervous, apparently, that a group of them, backed by some of Wall Street's biggest names, allegedly decided to overthrow the government. They approached Major General Smedley Butler, a decorated Marine, thinking he'd lead a fascist coup. Instead, Butler went straight to Congress and testified under oath about the plot. He named names. He detailed plans to install a dictator and create a paramilitary force of 500,000 veterans. Congress held hearings. They confirmed a plot existed. Then, nothing. No arrests, no prosecutions. The names were redacted from the public record. Some of the alleged conspirators included people connected to DuPont, Goodyear, and even Prescott Bush's banking partners. Butler spent the rest of his life warning about war profiteering and corporate power. Meanwhile, speaking of powerful people getting second chances, the US had a whole operation for that. After World War II, Operation Paperclip. World War II ends. The Nazis lose. Justice is served. Right? Well, mostly. Except the United States secretly recruited over 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers, and technicians, and brought them to America. They gave them new identities, new jobs, and very few questions about their wartime activities. This was Operation Paperclip, named after the paperclips used to attach new files to their dossiers. The recruits included Werner von Braun, who built Hitler's V-2 rockets using slave labor. He became the father of NASA's space program. Arthur Rudolph, who ran the Matilabidora factory, where 20,000 prisoners died, helped design the Saturn V rocket. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency actively whitewashed Nazi records, deleting references to war crimes and SS memberships. Their justification: we needed them before the Soviets got them, because apparently the Cold War required a few genocides to be overlooked. These scientists went on to have distinguished American careers. And if you're thinking the government never made morally questionable deals again, well, let me tell you about the 1980s. Iran-Contra affair. Picture this. It's the 1980s. The United States publicly calls Iran a terrorist state. We have an arms embargo against them. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the Reagan administration is secretly selling them weapons, lots of weapons. Why? To fund the Contras in Nicaragua, which Congress had explicitly forbidden. So, the administration sold missiles to Iran, marked up the prices, and funneled the profits to right-wing death squads in Central America. When a plane carrying weapons was shot down and the operation exposed, they called it a mistake in judgment. Oliver North shredded documents. Reagan said he didn't remember. 14 people were indicted. 11 were convicted. Most convictions were later overturned or pardoned by George H.W. Bush. The whole affair revealed a shadow foreign policy running parallel to official government positions. But illegal weapons deals weren't the only creative financing happening. Sometimes the justification for war itself turned out to be, let's say, flexible with the truth. Gulf of Tonkin incident. August 1964. The USS Maddox is in the Gulf of Tonkin. They report being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 2 days later, they report a second attack. President Johnson uses these attacks to push through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, giving him broad war powers in Vietnam. Here's the thing about that second attack: it never happened. The commander of the Maddox sent a follow-up message saying, freak weather effects and overeager tsunami may have accounted for many reports. But that cable was conveniently not shared with Congress. Johnson himself later admitted, for all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there. In 2005, declassified NSA documents confirmed it. The second attack was a mistake: bad sonar readings. Jumpy sailors. No actual enemy. But it gave the US the justification to escalate a war that would kill 58,000 Americans and over 2 million Vietnamese. And speaking of operations that happened while everyone was looking the other way, let's talk about what the CIA was doing in Los Angeles. CIA cocaine trafficking. In 1996, journalist Gary Webb published a series called Dark Alliance in the San Jose Mercury News. His investigation alleged that the CIA-backed Contras in Nicaragua helped smuggle cocaine into Los Angeles during the 1980s, fueling the crack epidemic. The CIA and major news outlets immediately attacked Webb, discrediting him and his reporting. He lost his job. His career was destroyed. Except here's the thing: he was mostly right. In 1998, the CIA's own Inspector General released a report confirming that CIA assets were involved in drug trafficking. The agency had looked the other way, while Contra supporters imported cocaine into the United States. They valued funding the Contras over stopping drug smuggling. Gary Webb died in 2004 from 2 gunshot wounds to the head. It was ruled a suicide. His reputation wasn't restored until years later, after his death, when other journalists revisited his work and confirmed its accuracy. But domestic drug problems weren't the only place where government ethics took a vacation. Sometimes they exported those ethics to other countries. Guatemala syphilis experiments. Remember the Tuskegee study, the one where the U.S. government watched syphilis destroy black men for 40 years? Turns out they also had an international version. From 1946 to 1948, U.S. Public Health Service doctors deliberately infected nearly 700 Guatemalans with syphilis and gonorrhea without their consent. The subjects included prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and sex workers. Some were infected through intentional exposure to infected prostitutes. Others were directly inoculated. At least 83 people died. The experiments were designed to test whether penicillin could prevent infection. The results were published in medical journals, but the methods were kept secret for over 60 years. In 2010, the story broke. President Obama officially apologized to Guatemala. Lawsuits were filed. The U.S. government settled but admitted no legal liability. Just another day in the long history of medical experiments without consent. And speaking of things done without consent, sometimes the government's harassment went beyond physical experimentation into psychological warfare. FBI's suicide letter to Martin Luther King Jr. We touched on COINTELPRO earlier, but this particular moment deserves its own spotlight. In 1964, shortly before Martin Luther King Jr. was set to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI sent him a letter. It was typed, anonymous. It called him a fraud and a hypocrite. It referenced FBI surveillance recordings of his private life, and then it strongly suggested, though not in explicit words, that he should kill himself. You are done, it said. There is but one way out for you. The letter was accompanied by a package containing audio recordings from FBI wiretaps. The implied message was clear. End your life, or we'll destroy your reputation and legacy. King didn't comply, obviously. He accepted the Nobel Prize. He continued his work. The FBI continued their campaign. J. Edgar Hoover called him the most notorious liar in the country. The letter was revealed years later and is now in the National Archives. You can read it yourself. It's exactly as chilling as you'd imagine. And with that comforting thought, we're 15 facts into this journey. Your eyelids are getting heavier. The government has gotten weirder. And we've got 86 more facts to go. Chemical weapons testing on American cities. But the FBI's psychological warfare was practically gentle compared to what the military was doing to entire cities. From the 1950s through the 1960s, the U.S. Army conducted hundreds of secret chemical tests on American populations. They sprayed zinc, cadmium, sulfur, potentially carcinogenic compound over Minneapolis, St. Louis, and Winnipeg. They released it from planes, from rooftops, from moving vehicles. The clouds drifted over schools, hospitals, residential neighborhoods. The Army claimed it was a harmless tracer material to study how chemical agents would disperse during a Soviet attack. They didn't bother mentioning the tests were happening. Decades later, when the program was exposed, some studies suggested the compound could cause lung damage and cancer. The Army maintained it was safe. They would know, after all. They had tested it on millions of people without asking. The tests were part of a larger program involving more than 200 cities. But if you think spraying chemicals over cities from a distance was concerning, wait until you hear what they did to soldiers up close. Edgewood, Arsenal experiments. From 1955 to 1975, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps ran experiments at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Over 7,000 soldiers were exposed to chemical and biological agents. Not in combat in labs, on purpose. The Army gave them LSD, PCP-BZ, a hallucinogen so powerful it could incapacitate people for days. They exposed them to sarin and VX nerve agents. Mustard gas. Soldiers were told they were testing equipment or uniforms. Many had no idea they were being used as human test subjects for weapons. The effects lasted for years. Some soldiers developed cancer. Others suffered psychological trauma, chronic illness, memory loss. When they tried to get treatment from the VA, their military records had been classified. They couldn't prove what had been done to them. In 2004, the Army finally acknowledged the program. By 2009, Congress passed a law requiring the Pentagon to identify and notify all test subjects. Thousands of men spent decades not knowing why they were sick. And if you think the military saved its worst weapons testing for enemy territory, well, they definitely did plenty there, too. The secret war in Laos. Let me tell you about a war most Americans don't even know happened. From 1964 to 1973, the United States dropped over 2 million tons of bombs on Laos. That's more than all the bombs dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. One plane load every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 years straight. Why? Laos was officially neutral during the Vietnam War, but the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through it. So, the US carpet-bombed the country in secret. Congress didn't know the full extent. The American public definitely didn't. 30% of those bombs didn't explode. There's still their 80 million unexploded cluster bombs scattered across the countryside. Since the war ended, over 20,000 Laotians have been killed or injured by leftover American ordnance. Mostly farmers, mostly children. Laos is the most heavily bombed country per capita in history, and it was technically a secret. Speaking of secret operations involving impaired judgment and poor decisions, the CIA had a whole program for that. Operation Midnight Climax. Remember MK-Ultra, the CIA's mind control program? Well, they had a special subproject. It was exactly as weird as it sounds. Operation Midnight Climax, which ran from 1954 to 1963, involved CIA agents paying prostitutes to lure unsuspecting men to safe houses in San Francisco and New York. Once inside, the men were drugged with LSD without their knowledge. CIA agents watched through two-way mirrors while the men had sex with the prostitutes, all while under the influence of powerful hallucinogens. The apartments were decorated to look like brothels, complete with photographs of women in bondage positions on the walls. The stated goal was to study whether LSD could be used for mind control and to gather blackmail material on Soviet spies. The actual result was a lot of confused Johns having very bad trips while federal agents took notes. When the program was exposed in the 1970s, most of the records had been destroyed. The men who were drugged, never identified, never compensated, never told what happened to them. And speaking of people who were never compensated, no compensation for Tuskegee families. Remember those 400 men in the Tuskegee study, the ones who were denied treatment for syphilis for 40 years? In 1974, the government settled a class action lawsuit. Survivors received $37,000 each. The families of the men who died got $15,000. But here's what didn't happen. No compensation for the wives who contracted syphilis from their infected husbands. No compensation for the children born with congenital syphilis. No compensation for the grandchildren who grew up without grandfathers, or for the decades of compounded poverty and trauma. The study infected wives and children through deliberate medical neglect. Those secondary victims, the women who trusted their husbands, the babies born with disabilities, received nothing. The settlement explicitly excluded them. In 1997, President Clinton formally apologized. He called it shameful. But apologies don't pay medical bills or bring back the dead. And speaking of things that can't be undone, sometimes the evidence gets destroyed before anyone can be held accountable. The CIA destroyed MK-Ultra records in 1973, as Watergate was exposing government misconduct left and right. CIA Director Richard Helms had a problem. MK-Ultra, the agency's illegal mind control program, was about to be investigated. So, he did what any reasonable person would do. He ordered the destruction of all MK-Ultra records. Thousands of documents were shredded. An estimated 90% of the program's files vanished. Everything from detailed experiment notes to financial records to the names of test subjects gone. What we know about MK-Ultra comes from the 10% that survived, mostly financial documents that had been misfiled and escaped destruction. This means we'll never know the full extent of the program. How many people were dosed? How many died? What were the actual results? The CIA successfully erased the evidence of one of the most extensive domestic human rights violations in American history. Helms was later convicted of lying to Congress about Chile. He received a fine and a suspended sentence. No one went to prison for MK-Ultra. And speaking of violations that went on for far too long, forced sterilization programs. Between 1907 and the 1970s, over 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under state eugenics laws. The targets: poor people, disabled people, people of color, people deemed feeble-minded or unfit to reproduce. Women were sterilized without consent during other medical procedures. Sometimes they were told they were having appendectomies. California led the nation with 20,000 forced sterilizations, but 32 states had eugenics laws. In Virginia, Carrie Buck was sterilized in 1927 after being raped because authorities decided her pregnancy proved she was morally delinquent. The Supreme Court upheld Virginia's sterilization law 8-1. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." The programs continued well into the 1970s. In some states, prisoners were offered reduced sentences in exchange for sterilization. Native American women were sterilized by Indian Health Service doctors without proper consent. Through the 1970s, The last forced sterilization law wasn't repealed until 2013. And if you think the eugenics mindset stayed in the courtroom, the military had their own twisted version. Mustard gas tests, segregated by race. During World War II, the U.S. military tested mustard gas and other chemical agents on approximately 60,000 American soldiers. These weren't accidental exposure tests. These were deliberate experiments to measure the effects of chemical weapons on human subjects. Here's where it gets worse. The tests were segregated by race. The military specifically wanted to see if Black and Puerto Rican soldiers would react differently to chemical weapons than white soldiers. They exposed these men to mustard gas that caused painful blisters, breathing problems, and long-term health issues. The men were sworn to secrecy. Their medical records were classified. When they developed cancer and other illnesses decades later, they couldn't prove their military service had caused it. So, they couldn't get VA benefits. The full extent of the program wasn't revealed until 2015, when NPR and the Department of Veterans Affairs finally investigated. Many of the test subjects had already died. Those still alive were in their 90s, still fighting for recognition and compensation. And speaking of people the government refused to recognize properly, let's talk about someone who became one of the most celebrated heroes of the 20th century. The FBI labeled Mandela a terrorist. Nelson Mandela, Nobel Peace Prize winner, international symbol of reconciliation and justice, celebrated statesman who helped end apartheid. Also, according to the United States government, a terrorist. From the 1980s until 2008, Nelson Mandela was on the U.S. terrorism watch list. This meant that, technically, every time he visited the United States, including to address the United Nations, he needed a special waiver, because he was classified as a terrorist threat. The listing dated back to when Mandela's organization, the African National Congress, was fighting apartheid in South Africa. The U.S. supported the apartheid government, so anti-apartheid activists were labeled terrorists. Even after Mandela was released from prison, became president of South Africa, won the Nobel Prize, and became globally celebrated, the U.S. didn't remove him from the list. Congress finally passed a bill in 2008, when Mandela was 90 years old, to remove him and other ANC members from the watch list. Better late than never, I suppose. And speaking of delayed responses to humanitarian crisis, let's talk about the 1980s. The Reagan administration ignored AIDS. In 1981, the first cases of a mysterious illness appeared among gay men in Los Angeles and New York. By 1982, it had a name: acquired immune deficiency syndrome. By 1985, over 12,000 Americans had died. During those years, President Reagan didn't publicly mention AIDS not once. His press secretary, Larry Speakes, laughed about it during press briefings. When reporters asked about the gay plague, Speakes made jokes. The press corps laughed along. You can listen to the recordings. They're as horrifying as you'd imagine. The Reagan administration opposed funding for AIDS research, blocked education campaigns, and refused to treat it as a public health emergency. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop wanted to mail AIDS information to every household in America. The White House blocked it for years. Reagan finally said the word AIDS publicly in 1987, after more than 20,000 Americans had died. By then, the disease had spread globally. The delayed response allowed the epidemic to spiral out of control. But while the administration ignored suffering at home, they were quite active in supporting violence abroad. Death squads in El Salvador. Throughout the 1980s, the United States provided military training, weapons, and over $1 billion to El Salvador's government during their civil war. That government ran death squads that murdered tens of thousands of civilians. In December 1980, for American church women, 3 nuns and a lay missionary were raped and murdered by El Salvador's National Guard. The women had been doing humanitarian work with refugees. 5 guardsmen eventually confessed. They said they had acted on orders from higher-ups. The Reagan administration initially blamed the victims. Secretary of State Alexander Haig suggested the women might have run a roadblock. UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick said they weren't just nuns, but political activists. The U.S. continued funding El Salvador's military. Over the next decade, El Salvador's death squads killed an estimated 75,000 people. The U.S. trained many of these soldiers at the School of the Americas. We knew what they were doing. We kept sending money anyway. And El Salvador wasn't an isolated case. The U.S. had a habit of overthrowing governments that disagreed with us. CIA coups of democratically elected leaders. Let's take a quick tour of the CIA's greatest hits in overthrowing democracy. Iran, 1953. The CIA orchestrated a coup against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized oil. They installed the Shah, whose brutal regime lasted until the Iranian Revolution, that revolution directly caused by resentment over the U.S.-backed coup. Guatemala, 1954. The CIA overthrew democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz because he tried land reform that threatened United Fruit Company. The coup led to a 40-year civil war that killed 200,000 Guatemalans. Congo, 1960. The CIA plotted to kill Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. He was assassinated within months of taking office. The country descended into decades of dictatorship. Chile, 1973. The CIA backed a military coup against Salvador Allende. Thousands were killed under Pinochet's dictatorship. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are declassified operations. The US systematically undermined democracies, installed dictators, and caused decades of suffering because we disagreed with their economic policies. And speaking of long-term suffering caused by American bombs, cluster bombs on Cambodia. While we were secretly bombing Laos, we were also secretly bombing Cambodia. From 1969 to 1973, the US dropped over 7 million tons of bombs on Cambodia. President Nixon and Henry Kissinger ordered the bombing campaign without telling Congress. The targets were supposed to be North Vietnamese supply routes. The reality was carpet bombing that killed between 150,000 and 500,000 Cambodian civilians. The bombing destabilized the country and helped the Khmer Rouge rise to power. Yes, the genocidal regime that killed 2 million people. American bombs helped create the conditions for that. And just like in Laos, many of the bombs didn't explode. Cambodia is still littered with unexploded ordnance. Since 1979, more than 64,000 Cambodians have been killed or injured by leftover American cluster bombs, farmers plowing fields, children finding strange metal objects. We destroyed a neutral country, helped trigger a genocide, and left behind a landscape of bombs that will keep killing people for generations. And speaking of American actions that keep causing harm decades later, let's talk about a CIA operation in Pakistan. Fake vaccination programs in Pakistan. In 2011, the CIA was hunting for Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan. They had a clever idea: run a fake hepatitis vaccination program to collect DNA samples from children in the compound where they suspected bin Laden was hiding. If they found DNA matching bin Laden's family, they'd know they had the right place. So, they recruited a Pakistani doctor, Sheikhul Afridi, and sent teams door-to-door offering free vaccines. Some of the vaccines were real, some weren't. The program was cut short when bin Laden was killed in the raid, but the damage was done. When the operation was exposed, trust in vaccination programs collapsed across Pakistan and parts of Afghanistan. Polio vaccination workers were murdered by Taliban militants who believed they were American spies. Pakistan became one of the last countries where polio remained endemic. The CIA's fake vaccination program directly contributed to vaccine hesitancy that has killed and paralyzed thousands of children. Health organizations around the world condemned the operation. The damage to public health continues today. But at least those were intentional operations. Sometimes the government just loses track of incredibly dangerous things. Lost nuclear weapons. Here's a fun fact to help you sleep. The United States has lost at least 6 nuclear weapons and never found them. These are officially called broken arrows, nuclear weapons accidents. The military admits to 32 broken arrow incidents, but at least 6 involved weapons that were never recovered. One is somewhere off the coast of Tybee Island, Georgia. A B-47 bomber collided with a fighter jet in 1958 and jettisoned a 7,000-pound Mark 15 nuclear bomb into the ocean. It's still there, probably. Another is in the waters off Palomares, Spain, where a B-52 crashed in 1966. They recovered 3 of the 4 nukes it was carrying. The 4th is at the bottom of the Mediterranean. There's one in Wassaw Sound near Savannah, lost in 1958. One near Greenland from a 1968 crash. The military says the lost weapons pose minimal radiation risk. They also said Agent Orange was safe and that atomic bomb tests wouldn't hurt anyone. So make of that what you will. And speaking of the government keeping tabs on things they probably shouldn't, let's talk about their obsession with a Beatle. FBI surveillance of John Lennon. In 1972, John Lennon moved to New York City. He was openly opposed to the Vietnam War. This made President Nixon and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover very nervous, especially since Lennon had a platform and Nixon had an election coming up. So, the FBI opened a file on Lennon. They tracked his movements. They attended his concerts. They monitored his phone calls. They compiled a 300-page dossier on a musician whose greatest crime was writing Imagine. The FBI also worked with the Immigration and Naturalization Service to try to deport Lennon for a 1968 marijuana conviction in Britain. The goal was to silence him before the election. Lennon fought the deportation for years while under constant surveillance. The campaign only ended when Nixon resigned. Lennon was finally granted permanent residency in 1976. His FBI file was partially released in 1997. Portions remain classified to this day, which raises questions about what exactly the FBI was doing beyond surveillance.